Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 14th chapter of the 4th book of Von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. Its title being Night Fighting, the text follows. The manner of conducting a combat at night and what concerns the details of its course is a tactical subject. We only examine it here so far as in its totality it appears as a special strategic means. Fundamentally, every night attack is only a more vehement form of surprise. Now, at the first look of the thing, such an attack appears quite preeminently advantageous, for we suppose the enemy to be taken by surprise, the assailant naturally to be prepared for everything which can happen. What an inequality! Imagination paints to itself a picture of the most complete confusion on the one side, and on the other side the assailant only occupied in reaping the fruits of his advantage. Hence the constant creation of schemes for night attacks by those who have not to lead them, and have no responsibility, whilst these attacks seldom take place in reality. These ideal schemes are all based on the hypothesis that the assailant knows the arrangements of the defender because they have been made and announced beforehand, and could not escape notice in his reconnaissances and inquiries; that, on the other hand, the measures of the assailant, being only taken at the moment of execution, cannot be known to the enemy. But the last of these is not always quite the case, and still less is the first. If we are not so near the enemy as to have him completely under our eye, as the Austrians had Frederick the Great before the Battle of Hochkirch, 1758, then all that we know of his position must always be imperfect, as it is obtained by reconnaissances, patrols, information from prisoners and spies, sources which no firm reliance can be placed, because intelligence thus obtained is always more or less of an old date, and the position of the enemy may have been altered in the meantime. Moreover, with the tactics and mode of encampment of former times, it was much easier than it is now to examine the position of the enemy. A line of tents is much easier to distinguish than a line of huts or a bivouac, and an encampment on a line of front, fully and regularly drawn out, also easier than one divisions formed in columns, the mode often used at the present. We may have the ground on which a division bivouacs in that manner completely under our eye, and yet not be able to arrive at any accurate idea. But the position again is not all that we want to know. The measures which the defender may take in the course of combat are just as important, and do not by any means consist in mere random shots. These measures also make night attacks more difficult in modern wars than formerly, because they have in these campaigns an advantage over those already taken. In our combats, the position of the defender is more temporary than definitive, and on that account the defender is better able to surprise his adversary with unexpected blows than he could formerly. Therefore, what the assailant knows of the defensive previous to a night attack is seldom or never sufficient to supply the want of direct observation. But the defender has on his side another small advantage as well, which is that he is more at home than the assailant on the ground which forms his position, and therefore, like the inhabitant of a room, will find his way about it in the dark with more ease than a stranger. He knows better where to find each part of his force, and therefore can more readily get at it than is the case with his adversary. From this it follows that the assailant in a combat at night feels the want of his eyes just as much as the defender, and that therefore only particular reasons can make a night attack advisable. Now, these reasons arise mostly in connection with subordinate parts of an army, rarely with the army itself. It follows that a night attack also, as a rule, can only take place with secondary combats, and seldom with great battles. We may attack a portion of the enemy's army with a very superior force, consequently enveloping it with a view either to take the wall, or to inflict very severe loss on it by an equal combat provided that other circumstances are in favor. But such a scheme can never succeed except by a great surprise, because no fractional part of the enemy's army would engage in such an unequal combat, but would retire instead. But a surprise on an important scale, except in rare instances in a very close country, can only be effected at night. If therefore we wish to gain such an advantage as this from the faulty disposition of a portion of the enemy's army, then we must make use of the night at all events to finish the preliminary part, even if the combat itself should not open till towards daybreak. This is therefore what takes place in all the little enterprises by night against outposts and other small bodies, the main point being invariably through superior numbers and getting round his position to entangle him unexpectedly in such disadvantageous combats that he cannot disengage himself without great loss. The larger the body attack, the more difficult the undertaking, because a strong force has greater resources within itself to maintain the fight long enough for help to arrive. On that account, the whole of the enemy's army can never, in ordinary cases, be the object of such an attack. For although it has no assistance to expect from any quarter outside itself, still it contains within itself sufficient means of repelling attacks from several sides, particularly in our day, when every one from the commencement is prepared for this very usual form of attack. Whether the enemy can attack us on several sides with success depends generally on conditions quite different from that of its being done unexpectedly. Without entering here into the nature of these conditions, we confine ourselves to observing that with turning an enemy great results as well as great dangers are connected, that therefore, if we set aside special circumstances, nothing justifies it but a great superiority, just such as we should use against a fractional part of the enemy's army. But the turning and surrounding a small fraction of the enemy, and particularly in the darkness of night, is also more practicable for this reason, that whatever we stake upon it, and however superior the force used may be, still probably it constitutes only a limited portion of our army, and we can sooner stake that the whole on the risk of a great venture. Besides, the greater part, or perhaps the whole, serves as a support and rallying point for the portion risked, which again very much diminishes the danger of the enterprise. Not only the risk, but the difficulty of execution as well confines night enterprises to small bodies. As surprise is the real essence of them, so also stealthily approach is the chief condition of execution, but this is more easily done with small bodies than with large, and for the columns of a whole army is seldom practicable. For this reason, such enterprises are in general only directed against single outposts, and can only be feasible against greater bodies if they are without sufficient outposts, like Frederick the Great at Hochkirch. This will happen seldomer in future to armies themselves than to minor divisions. In recent times, when war has been carried out so much more rapidly, with much more rapidity and vigor, it has in consequence often happened that armies have encamped very close to each other without having a very strong system of outposts, because those circumstances have generally occurred just at the crisis which precedes a great decision. But then at such times the readiness for battle on both sides is also more perfect. On the other hand, in former wars it has been frequent practice for armies to take up camps in sight of each other, when they had no other object but that of mutually holding each other in check, consequently for a longer period. How often Frederick the Great stood for weeks so near to the Austrians that the two might have exchanged cannon shots with each other. But these practices, certainly more favorable to night attacks, have been discontinued in later days, and armies being now no longer in regard to subsistence and requirements for encampment, such independent bodies, complete in themselves, find it necessary to keep usually a day's march between themselves and the enemy. If we now keep in view especially the night attack of an army, It follows that sufficient motives for it can seldom occur, and that they fall under one or other of the following classes. 1. An unusual degree of carelessness or audacity, which very rarely occurs, and when it does, it is compensated for by a great superiority in moral force. 2. A panic in the enemy's army, or generally such a degree of superiority in moral force on our side, that this is sufficient to supply the place of guidance in action. 3. Cutting through the enemy's army of superior force, which keeps us enveloped, because in this all depends on surprise, and the object of merely making a passage by force allows much greater concentration of forces. 4. Finally, in desperate cases, when our forces have such a disproportion to the enemy's that we see no possibility of success, except through extraordinary daring. But in all these cases, there is still the condition that the enemy's army is under our eyes and protected by no advance guard. As for the rest, most night combats are so conducted as to end with daylight, so that only the approach and the first attack are made under cover of darkness, because the assailant in that manner can better profit by the consequences of the state of confusion into which he throws his adversary, and combats of this description, which do not commence until daybreak, in which the night therefore is only made use of to approach, are not to be counted as night combats. So this is the conclusive chapter of the fourth book, in which von Clausewitz, as you understand, analyzes night fighting in general, and in this broader situation that comes at the end properly of what the movements after the battle have been, because this is, after all, we've seen in the last chapters we've analyzed the pursuit, and in a way this is important tactical chapter that von Clausewitz had not specifically addressed as much as at least the night fighting is concerned, and the specific conditions that occur in this time. Right, not just because of the darkness, but indirectly because of it, and the encampment, the broader, problems occurring also because paradoxically just of the hour, but specifically because naturally of the lack of the generalized lack of information that are present in this context. So this is rarely, as you understand, the business of a whole army, but something more complex that, in one sense, is always connected in clash between the two armies, but is also impeded by several factors. Now, without much further ado, let's simply analyze it. So night fighting, the manner of conducting a combat at night, and what concerns the details of its course, is a tactical subject we'll examine here as so far as in its totality it appears as a special strategic means. Right, so it's not naturally just how the action is carried out, but properly what it means at a strategical level to engage in those circumstances. So fundamentally, every night and the decision attached to it. Fundamentally, every night attack is only a more vehement form of surprise. Right, this is what von Clausewitz says. Now, at the first look, he doesn't explain fundamentally why, because here he makes an example and then ridiculizes it, and it's not so as it seems. What it means here, and as it's explained naturally also afterwards, is that, of course, the night presents, this conceal, because of the lack of light, a concealment of the enemy movements. So whatever happens is seemingly, of course, less, not just less expected or less predictable, but properly less observable. Right, and this is in fact the key to understand that night fighting and the effect of surprise proper in this regard is reduced by lots of other factors. Of course, the moment in which an enemy pops out of darkness and you don't know what to do about it is just very like one-to-one. Like it's what you individually cognitively can experience, but at large, and especially for what the broader command and control of these forces are involved, as we've seen also in the previous chapters, von Clausewitz said it at a point, it's actually an enormously difficult enterprise that is also not carried out at all with the same dash, let's say, and an especially positive object that what a more informed, we could say, sensorially speaking proper, because this is a matter of sight, most assault would be, and surprise would be. So von Clausewitz says, now at the first look of the thing, such an attack appears quite preeminently advantageous, for we suppose the enemy to be taken by surprise, the assailant by naturally to be prepared for everything which can happen. What an inequality, right? Imagination paints to itself a picture of the most complete confusion on the one side, and on the other side the assailant only occupied in reaping the fruits of his advantage. Hence the constant creation of schemes for night attacks by those who have not led them and have no responsibility, whilst these attacks seldom take place in reality. Right? And this is beautiful sarcasm, objectively, that I appreciate very much, especially in this case, because von Clausewitz every once in a while uses it, and I don't like sarcasm very much, but for the simple reason that in order to be sarcastic, you need, the intelligence for it. Definitely von Clausewitz has it. And it touches a point that we stressed a lot of time. Von Clausewitz is rarely so, even in here, it's not like completely overt, like direct about it, but it's really also because he lived 200 years ago, and I suppose that today we suffer much more of this misunderstanding than in the past, right? Because the past was much more practically oriented. We know that people simply reasoned in less theoretical terms. Von Clausewitz here is criticizing the theory, but as far as an elite was concerned, exactly the one to which he belonged, of the one of high officers first, but also military theorists more specifically, so these great military minds that were forced naturally to reason theoretically. And he said what happens today is that most people reason theoretically, right? At least in the Western world, it's overwhelming, right? The thing has inverted. We know from the beginning of the last century, the change has been astonishing. So we tend to fall much more frequently in this mistake, that is to pretend always, when especially we think about war, and this is very really sometimes even a war gamistic prejudice of so we have already criticized throughout all the Vom Kriege series, is the idea of image, and that goes against the laws of reciprocity of the Vom Kriege, that the Vom Kriege explains. The idea of conceiving the enemy as a sort of passive thing that stays there, you can basically target, harass at your will, so that everything you do fundamentally is pre-planned. You have an option of doing it in the first place among many others. You don't have to think about anything else. You more or less imagine how it could be, and then you think it's just what it takes. Here von Clausewitz rightfully says that not only you have no idea about what leading them means, because you haven't been there, but also you have no idea of the responsibility that they entail, because of all the risks that you're under playing here, connected to the night, just because you think, let's do it at night because this is much greater surprise. Yes, but what about your control on this all, right? So much that von Clausewitz says these attacks, not surprisingly, seldom take place in reality, right? And there is a specific reason, right? It's not that people are, less daring than you are. In a way, that's what wouldn't be true if you were just confronted with the situation immediately, but, detached from it, you sound overwhelmingly bold, but because, once again, you haven't experienced it, what it means. Von Clausewitz says these ideal schemes are all based on the hypothesis that the assailant knows the arrangements of the defender, because they have been made and announced beforehand, and could not escape notice in his reconnaissance and inquiries. So this is clear. Most of the time you have no idea what the enemy is doing, what he's about concretely, and what there is out there. The situation changes also. It says that, on the other hand, the measures of the assailant being only taken at the moment of execution cannot be known to the enemy, right? Why not, in a way? That's all what they're properly fearing and prepared for. But the last of these is not always quite the case, and still less the first, right? So, more specifically, it's more a problem, a neurozoological problem of the assailant, the possibility of understanding what is going on out there that is way more impacting than what the surprise can do in over against the enemy proper. That is what you are hoping for, that is going to happen, right? Also, he writes, if we are not so near the enemy as to have him completely under our eye, as the Austrians had Frederick the Great before the Battle of Hochkirch in 1758, then all that we know of his position must always be imperfect, as it is obtained by reconnaissance, patrols, information from prisoners and spies, sources on which no firm reliance can be placed, because intelligence thus obtained is always more or less of an old date, and the position of the enemy may have been altered in the meantime. Right? This is so elementary. You don't know what the enemy is preparing for, and even the information that you receive cannot, especially in this situation, be checked so easily. The enemy is up to something, and not necessarily what these information providers, they may have changed idea. Things move literally. So, moreover, Clausewitz adds, with the tactics and mode of encampment of former times, it was much easier than it is now to examine the position of the enemy. A line of tents is much easier to distinguish than a line of huts or a bivouac, and an encampment of a line of front fully and regularly drawn out as also easier than one of divisions formed in columns, the mode often used at present. We may have the ground on which the divisions bivouacs in that manner completely under our eye, and yet not be able to arrive at any accurate idea. This is particularly important. He's referring to a really true thing, like the idea that before past times armies were smaller, so they were also kind of more easily identifiable just at a first glance. But now armies are enormous. You don't know what they are up to. This is, of course, von Clausewitz is speaking of Napoleonic warfare, but generally speaking, this is valid. Here is making a relative point in historical terms, but it's not that this, in past time it was so dramatically easier. Today, in many ways, it's less. Even also because armies properly fight in different ways, true, but simply because of the same situation that the enemy is trying its best also to conceal in part. And you don't know whether this division is at the head of a column or is all the enemy's forces. You may not know. And so, in a way, in the past, it was easier, right? When armies were smaller, even the largest ones, we mean, you knew that they encamped somewhere, and that was it, right? Today, it's very different, right? Von Clausewitz adds, but the position again is not all that we want to know. The measures which the defender may take in the course of the combat are just as important. That is to say, okay, the enemy is deployed there. In a way, we can't count him organically, but where are, first of all, other forces? Is there any other forces in the first place? And also, what are they going to do when attacked? Right, because that, as we've seen with the increased use of reserves, over time, these larger forces, on average employed, usually proceed in an attrition battle that brings the reserves in. So it's mostly troops that you don't fully see, right? And the ones that are out there, most likely a vanguard of a much larger, the army that is meant just by fight to arrive later on the spot, right? So this is a bit the leitmotif that von Clausewitz uses throughout this chapter. It's saying, this thing is too big. The battle proceeds too complexly to simply say, okay, now I take out that single avant-post, it's done. There are other forces out there. There are other avant-posts. So he's measuring naturally the enlargement of European armies of the time compared to the past, and realizing that this is probably a problem of space and visibility, because I understand night is that problem at all times in human history, but armies enlarge. So while the sight in the darkness is always the same, the dimensions of the armies are large. So you proportionally the larger the army is, and the least you are informed at night about what the enemy is up to. So this is the real problem, actually, and what makes it so complicated, after all, exactly in those circumstances in which this attacks should be more not more advisable, as we understand here, because this is the denial of it, but in the moments in which you want to wipe out an entire enemy army. I mean, as long as it's a small detachment, as we see here, also an isolated avant-post, it's one thing. Wiping out, like thinking to attack the enemy at night en masse, well, that's a risk, right? For many reasons. Here, von Clausewitz doesn't even explain. I mean, the most obvious fact, you don't even realize what your own troops are doing better than what you can do in the day. So it's consistently evident what a problem of this kind can represent. And von Clausewitz writes that these we have seen the measures the enemy can pretend are not by any means consistent in random shooting. These measures also make so it's not just about engaging the enemies, it's that you should do something about it, pressing on it, and you don't know, because in the darkness you don't know where you're going to go with this. You don't know what's beyond, where there is other enemy or not, and the enemy in a way knows better, because you are the attacker, not the defender. In fact, that's also what von Clausewitz is about to say later. Before he adds, these measures also make night attacks more difficult in modern wars than formerly, because they have in these campaigns an advantage over those already taken. In our combats, the position of the defender is more temporary than definitive, and on that account the defender is better able to surprise his adversary with unexpected blows than he could formerly. This is particularly important, right? The idea that entrenchment, encampment, with the enlargement of armies, the increase of firepower, is becoming a bit basically useless, right? That's the peak of it was reached in medieval times, right? Where, okay, an army has entrenched itself in that camp. Sometimes it was really simply no way you could break through, right? At this point, everything is way more fluid, so it's not much about the terrain in itself, but literally the amount of troops the enemy has. That the larger are, the more can be composed, the more the use of reserves of them can be done, as we were saying before, and so on. So it's warfare of the time is normally pretty setting the conditions for predisposing better of reserves, and therefore even if you manage to attack to suppress the first line of the enemy, there are others behind, and those are meant exactly to move, right, not to remain passive. Things change as you understand in Western warfare. In fact, there are interesting parallelisms between, especially what von Clausewitz will say later about the glow at the end, towards when essentially where the enemy is entrenched, right? Think about World War I, war of position. In fact, many tactics at the time were, think about stormtroopers and so on, were designed exactly by studying accurately what all the enemy's the defensive system was about, because the position was left fundamentally in that way. This is also complicated because it was in a way of small units tactics, but not only, right? It was also on a larger scale, but it was properly based on the knowledge of what you had in front, because you knew the enemy was there, right? In Napoleonic times, things were way more dynamic, as you know, and this posed exactly the problem of, okay, we're not going to stay here forever, right? If the enemy, it was like if the stronger pressured, let's put it in this way, the weaker retreated. It was a constant move in this regard. There was probably not great deal of entrenchment, position warfare, and defensivistic attitudes, right, involved. This naturally clarifies why von Clausewitz attributes so much importance. I mean, why he actually believes that night fighting is not a great thing, right? Even if you want to surprise the enemy, because it turns out it's actually endangering your forces most of the times than anything else, but is definitely true, as always, to the Vom Kriege, to any moment in warfare. After all, von Clausewitz doesn't categorize in here. Just says, in our times now it's, more difficult than before. But the points that he makes here are wholly valid, right? And you can easily calibrate the whole thing for any age, right? Any era of warfare. Then von Clausewitz says, therefore, what the assailant knows of the defensive previous to a night attack is seldom or never sufficient to supply the want of direct observation. That is to say, let's be honest about it, most of the times, looking at what the enemy's position like until you go there and test him and see what happens is not enough for guiding a night attack and pretending you can prevent enemy moves effectively, or even trying to surprise him in that regard, or hoping in the surprise itself. In fact, von Clausewitz also says, but the defender has on his side another small advantage as well, which is that he is more at home than assailant on the ground which forms his position, and therefore, like the inhabitant of a room, will find his way about it in the dark with more ease than a stranger. He knows better where to find each part of his force, and therefore can more readily get at it than is the case with his adversary. Though, I would add, is also at night wondering where his own forces are, right? Don't think that you know it at all times, especially as combat ensues, and given the defender is mostly using a defensive attitude anyway, right? So of course he knows better the place, right? He's on it. He has seen it during the day in a way you haven't, and he is properly from the defensive side in a strong form, therefore, of combat, and he is just to defend fundamentally on perimeter most of the time. So of course he can try to envelop you, to make flank attacks as well. It's going to become difficult for him to do so, as we will see now, as much as for the assailant is, right? This chapter is much about attack and defense, after all. And simply, you know better, you know the distances, you know the connections, you know what it's in between, right? The assailant doesn't. Then von Clausewitz writes, from this it follows that the assailant in a combat at night feels the want of his eyes just as much as the defender, and that therefore only particular reasons can make a night attack advisable. Now these reasons arise mostly in connection with subordinate parts of an army, rarely with the army itself. It follows that a night attack also as a rule can only take place with secondary combats and seldom with great battles. This is a bit what we were explaining before, that is the risk posed by the darkness in this regard is most of the times, as we've seen also in the chapters about the pursuit when attacking, the enemy encampments, etc., which is the case in here, because at night combat normally stops and the whole army is resting, usually. The action cannot, you cannot bet your for victory in this regard, without much danger. And therefore, it's like, if you have an advantage in that regard, why would you use it, right? And in fact, von Clausewitz says there are few circumstances, we'll see later, when this can be useful, but it's most of the times not, right? And for this reason, it's usually actually carried out by smaller detachments of the armies, mostly an avant-garde. That, however, is going to meet what also the enemy, knowing your position, the larger, especially the forces involved are, the more this is true, will counter to with another vanguard or rearguard in this case, maybe, but let's say, so with another force that is specifically placed there to be just the first line, so that if the enemy attacks, the rest of the army is behind, surprise is over, and reserves can pour in to sustain the defense, right? So this is particularly clear as a concept, as I understand it. There isn't really much to see, and this is completely also devoid of further strategical considerations, such as the fact that also the assailant troopers are mostly tired, especially after a battle or a pursuit. This is another point. But specifically, in terms of surprise, this is what von Clausewitz is explaining to us. This may not be a good idea at all, right? Do not count on it much. Von Clausewitz writes, we may attack a portion of the enemy's army with a very superior force, consequently enveloping it with a view either to take the wall or to inflict very severe loss on it by an unequal combat, provided that the other circumstances are in our favor, right? Overwhelming small detachments, small avant-posts was done. I was studying just recently about it for a reason. For example, the army at night had to pass basically from a valley to another by surprise, and between the over the watershed and the mountains between the two valleys, there was an avant-post. It was pretty small, right? So it was easy to overwhelm in a way before the enemy army could get there by reinforcement. So the guys storm it and take it and descend on the other side of the watershed. That's a good example. But Clausewitz says such a scheme can never succeed except by a great surprise, because no fractional part of the enemy's army would engage in such an unequal combat, right? But would retire instead. But a surprise on an important scale, except in rare instances, in a very close country, can only be effected at night. If therefore we wish to gain such an advantage as this from the faulty disposition of a portion of the enemy's army, then we must make use of the night, at all events, to finish the preliminary part, even if the combat itself should not open till towards daybreak. And the example I made, for example, is very fitting, because the guys were to fight a battle in the other side of the watershed the day after, and the whole thing was to get themselves there by storming the avant-post, right? So the object was not engaging the enemy army at night, was in that case simply to get in the condition to be able to get the enemy army from the other side unexpectedly, right? Because that is also a thing, right? An avant-post at night may be exactly employed to render the rest of the army that it may be somewhere else, not very far, but secure that until that avant-post is not attacked, there's no way the enemy is gonna break through there. The example in which that I made is a bit more complex, because the position was very strong. This also was in medieval times, so it was a difficult, there were other barriers, ditches, trenches, it's different, and naturally every situation varies a while. But here the concept is pretty clear, right? Just if you have to catch these forces by surprise, by taking them, even to trying to outflank and so on, best thing is most of the time not to mess up things from your side, right, during the night, right? Because you may have that overwhelming advantage, but in daylight everything will be clearer in a way. So if you really have it, it's better spent at that point, unless, of course, the situation broadly meant doesn't push you to, simply get it done at the moment for any specific situation. Then von Clausewitz says, "This is therefore what takes place in all the little enterprises by night against outposts and other small bodies, the main point being invariably through superior numbers and getting round his position, to entangle him unexpectedly in such a disadvantageous combat that he cannot disengage himself without great loss." Right. So here von Clausewitz specifically, and understand now, is talking about naturally a very different context from just a medieval one, but specifically stressing that an outpost is right. It's not an all-round fortification most of the times, and that therefore by deploying, like simply cutting, for example, the supply line, right, or communication line, etc., is enough to force these troops, for example, to try to break through, the block, and from another direction. So that's what it's going to take. Not even assaulting, storming the area, right? But simply placing yourself in a point, which is advantageous, von Clausewitz says, because if you really have that advantage, given that you don't have excessive problems of times, just wait the day break. So that maybe these guys will not even engage you at that point, will maybe simply surrender if they have been taken out, or at least they will try to fight. In a situation in which the daylight favors more clearly the realization that you are so superior in numbers in this case that it's going to make the enemy despair, and that's probably the thing. Then von Clausewitz says, "The larger the body attacked, the more difficult the undertaking." We have seen it, because a strong force has greater resources within itself to maintain the fight long enough for help to arrive. So not only they can last more, but as we have seen, they can also be more flexible, right? They can commit more forces in ways that you may not foretell and foresee and probably see during the night happening. Then von Clausewitz writes, "On that account, the whole of the enemy's army can never, in ordinary cases, be the object of such an attack. For although it has no assistance to expect from any quarter outside itself, still it contains within itself sufficient means of repelling attacks from several sides, particularly in our day, when every one from the commencement is prepared for this very usual form of attack." Right? It's it's pretty common that these attacks are carried out frontally, right? That fundamentally what it's going to be about. Von Clausewitz here, he's not really contradicting himself. He's saying that such attacks are frequent in the measure in which naturally you can't keep. Also, they may be simply feints, right? It's very common as a strategy more than a tactic, but attacking the enemy camp just to keep the enemy confused and alert during the night and making it sleep. It's a pretty good one, telling the truth. And aside from this, it's also pretty common to happen. So it's not that people are specifically triggered by that, surprised, let's say, by the fashion. Von Clausewitz also says, "Whether the enemy can attack us on several sides with success depends generally on conditions quite different from that of its being done unexpectedly. Without entering here into the nature of these conditions, we confine ourselves to observing that with turning an enemy great results as well as great dangers are connected, that therefore if we set aside special circumstances, nothing justifies it but a great superiority, just such as we should use against fractional part of the enemy's army." So, try to outflank the enemy if you can, but always be aware of the fact that this is very risky. So, paradoxically, the more you're superior, and the more you're risking, after all, in a maneuver that by itself is well-renowningly risky, right? So, the more you're putting at stake, if this is such a an overwhelming superiority why the night? This is what von Clausewitz is saying at the end of the day. Von Clausewitz also says, but the turning and surrounding a small fraction of the enemy, and particularly in the darkness of night, and here sulking also with small forces from your side, is also more practicable for this reason, that whatever we stake upon it, and however superior the force used may be, still probably constitutes only a limited portion of our army, right? So mostly, there is a certain amount we can risk still, and we can sooner stake that than the wall on the risk of a great venture. Besides, the greater part, or perhaps the wall, serves as a support and rally point for the portion risked, which again very much diminishes the danger of enterprise. And this is the other realization: is the more troops you leave in reserve, and the easier it's going to be for those guys who are you've sent to outflank the enemy to fall back on the point, saying, that's a large force we have back there. They're not gonna go on, right? So the point is clear, and it tells you that you can make these experiments. You can't simply send units to make reconnaissance of the ground, exactly because it's night and you don't know how it's there. But if you send a few, it's fine, right? And after all, it's also easier for them to carry out the enterprise with less danger too. So von Clausewitz says not only the risk but the difficulty of execution as well confines night enterprises to small bodies. As surprise is the real essence of them, so also stealthily approaches the chief condition of execution. But this is more easily done with small bodies than with large, and for the columns of a whole army is seldom practicable. For this reason, such enterprises are in general only direct against a single outposts, and can only be feasible against greater bodies if they are without sufficient outposts, like Frederick the Great at Hochkirch. This will happen seldomer in future to armies themselves than to minor divisions. So consider also this, that the least a place is entrenched, and naturally the more this can work in a way, but at that point you have to be pretty damn sure of what the rest of the enemy forces is about, because it could be, as we've seen in Napoleonic here, or even a good idea, because after all these troops are made to attack, to invade. They have enough firepower to carry it out, and there's not a great deal of entrenchment generally, but still, exactly for that that happens as a consequence, say better, of the fact that armies are larger and that they are more powerful on their own. So the forces they can unleash during the fight are very dangerous, unpredictable in a way. They're more complex, in their employment, and this makes it all pretty difficult to really to recollect in a way before. Right? You don't know what's the enemy reaction going to be. Von Clausewitz then adds, in recent times, when war has been carried on so much more rapidity and vigor, it has in consequence often happened that armies have encamped very close to each other without having a very strong system of outposts, because those circumstances have generally occurred just at the crisis which precedes a great decision. But then, at such times, the readiness for battle on both sides is also more perfect. On the other hand, in former wars it was frequent practice for armies to take up camps inside of each other, when they had no other object but that of mutually holding each other in check, consequently for a longer period. How often Frederick the Great stood for weeks so near to the Austrians that the two might have exchanged cannon shots with each other. Right, so this was also kind of fairly recent history. That allowed, in a way, to just even concentrate on the spot where the armies were smaller. The entrenchments were more effective, so in a way, surprise could be easier, because once you passed the entrenchments that were fixed and you could study over days, you could really take by surprise an enemy army. Now, enemy forces are more easily attackable, right? Because the entrenchments do not work as much as before. But still, conversely, this is because the enemy armies are more combat ready, and couldn't be a great idea to try to surprise them in that sense, as we've seen. Clausewitz writes, but these practices, certainly more favorable to night attacks, have been discontinued in later years. Right? So he's talking about taken by surprise at night. In armies being now no longer in regard to subsistence and requirements for encampment, such independent bodies complete in themselves find it necessary to keep usually a day's march between themselves and the enemy. Right? So they tend also to have enlarged the distance between an army and another, so that properly, this tells you how more dangerous it is an attack in that situation, because literally you can perform it with greater offensive capability. It's just that you don't know what the other is going to do. So it's become this unpredictability brought to this larger systems in which more is at stake to avoid that and to encamp at a greater distance. That ensures them more safety, and therefore also renders more difficult to surprise the enemy as a consequence. Clausewitz says, if we now keep in view especially the night attack of an army, it follows that sufficient motives for it can seldom occur, and that they fall under one or other of the following cases. So now he lists what are those circumstances, modern times, let's say, in his times, that could bring to a night attack, not necessarily successful, but what could prompt it. And we start 1, right? An unusual degree of carelessness or audacity, which very rarely occurs, and when it does, it is compensated for by a great superiority in moral force. Moral force is everything, as we have already said many times. Therefore, if you are sure that the enemy is broken, and that after all, nor the size of the army, nor the defenses and so on, or the night can, constitute this great problem, usually does anyway, but that can be a good reason, right? It's simply saying, okay, attack directly, because you know that even if things can go badly, the sheer force you employ in here is able to destroy the enemy. 2. A panic in the enemy's army, or generally such a degree of superiority in moral force on our side that this is sufficient to supply the place of guidance in action. And actually, I don't understand why it differs from the first. This is my bad, actually. It's not from Clausewitz. Okay, yes. So he was saying this is in a way, the double face of the same metal, right? First it says, that you are actually careless, so you don't give a damn, you do it anyway. In many ways, this can happen in the second. As von Clausewitz properly says, the reasons can fall under one or the other following classes. So this is contained to, can be contained to, on the fact that you are careless in this regard, because you may know, as we said before, that you have this overwhelming moral superiority that I created as an example. It's contained in the second condition. Yeah, it's really permeable in this sense. So 3, cutting through an enemy's army of superior force which keeps us enveloped, because in this all depends on surprise, and the object of merely making a passage by force allows much greater concentration of forces. This also can be contained in the others. I mean, you may do it because you're desperate as well. In fact, this is also what the 4th point is about. You know that the enemy is trapping you, so there's no other way but to break through. There are many examples, right? And you know that if you do it on basing yourself on surprise, if the enemy envelopes, it's because he's pretty confident about his capabilities here. So he might have overstretched, but once again, your moral superiority may be enough to surprise them in that sense, break through, right? Very beautiful. I like how these 4 points are all compenetrate each other in a way. They could be all part of the same situation. 4. Finally, in desperate cases, when our forces have such a disproportion to the enemy's that we see no possibility of success except through extraordinary daring. That is to say, surprise. You bet everything on the surprise effect, right? because you're so desperate that you see that may be the only actual way before, I don't know, day breaks. And so, yeah, these are very beautiful. It's the first time I see Von Clausewitz doing these, if I'm not wrong, this kind of multi-variable perspective, or even of something that can fit to a single reality. If you read these 4 points, they all seem similar because they could actually, in fact, overlap. And then von Clausewitz concludes by saying, as for the rest, most night combats are so conducted as to end with daylight, right? So that only the approach and the first attack are made under cover of darkness, because the assailant in that manner can better profit by the consequences of the state of confusion into which he throws his adversary, and combats of this description which do not commence until daybreak, in which the night therefore is only made use of to approach, are not to be counted as night combats. That is to say, night combats fundamentally may just occur in situations in which you're not going to fight on that specific day. This is also, as we've seen, particularly important because it reveals that you may use them in ways that are fundamentally just functional to a further fight that is going to take place during the day. Alright, so yeah, and so rereading it briefly, yeah. So yeah, you understand how relatively useless these is, except certain cases that are definitely not the brightest ones, in a way. And it's interesting indeed. And here we conclude the 4th chapter. Next time we'll pass to the fighting forces, to the military forces, however you want to call them. And it's a brand new aspect of the world. And it gets really intense because there are also certain dispositions. There are many factors interplaying, and it gets more complicated also to explain. But that's better because it's more challenging. So for now we stop it here, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.